what I'm going to do, I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of my 3 or 4 main arguments. Then I'm going to be giving 3 case studies, one about Guam, one about Malaysia, and one about Hong Kong. I'm hoping to do all of that within 35 minutes because I think 40 minutes is the absolute maximum. Any of us can pay attention on Zoom. And then we will hopefully open this up for Q&A and conversation and coffee at another time. So as I have thought a lot about my work is obviously not a European project. My work is based in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. But as I've spoken to, and as I've been here now for 2 months, I've been thinking about the way my work does resonate in Central Europe, and also the way, obviously, I've been thinking about Ukraine, and I imagine everyone here has been as well. And to what extent what I've done is relevant, what has changed, how can we actually think about the contemporary problems of Ukraine, looking at some of these historical moments. Main analytical points is to look at international policy. My work, my goal is, and this goes to Jana's point, local stories of international politics, to make sure the project works at the international level, the regional or state level, and at the ground level. And how to write a story where all 3 of those narratives are intertwined. So if we look first at the international level, my work looks at the UNHCR, it looks at the United States, and international refugee policy. And in particular, I'm going to be looking at 1979 and a Geneva conference in 1979 that offered Vietnamese refugee status. And I'm going to be looking at a regional conference in 1989 when Vietnamese lost that refugee status and were transformed into asylum seekers who had to prove that they had the right to be resettled and gain refugee status. And as I was, it made me think a lot about how does this resonate or not with the politics between the EU and Turkey? When we think about regional agreements, when we think about policies of trying to restrict rather than policies of attempting to resettle. And here, my colleague Muga Dalkaran is here. I know you're more expert in this, but to really trying to think about regional international refugee policy and how does it change over time. So that's level 1. Level 2 is the level of the host country, and in my case, also colony. I look at 2 countries, Hong Kong and the Philippines, and I look at 2 places that when I was writing about them still had colonial status, those being Guam and Hong Kong. And obviously Malaysia and the Philippines also have colonial histories as well. And my research is, the goal is to investigate what are the local politics of those places. Why does Guam take in Vietnamese refugees? Do they have any choice in the matter at all? What are the politics in a place like the Philippines that is independent, but very much dependent on the United States for economic and military projects? How about Hong Kong, which is a British colony, which when I'm writing about it is very much in the transition moment before becoming under Chinese sovereignty again. And I argue that these local politics will very much shape each country's own refugee policies and who will get refugee status and who will not. Refugee activism on the ground. And much of the representations of refugees in the media, and this includes both left and right-wing representations, there's often images of individuals who are desperate, often children. There's often a sense of passivity, of hopelessness. And in my work, I attempt to demonstrate refugee activism and ongoing refugee political activity. And this is very much key to my work, as you'll see in my first and my last examples. And as I've spoken to some of you, my work obviously is also in conversation with colleagues and scholars who look at camps and places of, quote, exception, places which have legal complexities, or there's question of what law is applied. This goes to my earlier scholarship on the US Naval Base in Guantanamo Bay. While my research has moved around a lot geographically, a lot of what I've looked at legal status is very much debated, and there's often a friction between local law, international law, or a lack of law. We should also know that the refugee camps acted as places that could both be places of protection to places that were very much places of imprisonment. And to thinking about how we view these spaces, which on the one hand were often proclaimed to be offering first asylum and basic protection. On the other hand, particularly by the men and women who were held there, were seen as places of imprisonment, of cruelty, of lack of rights. And we should also recognize that individuals in the camps do not have rights to lawyers. And unlike other places of incarceration, there are generally not end dates. So people could often be there for long periods of time. And with this, again, I am more interested in looking at political activism and resistance than simply looking at a sense of like, I'll be in some ways a little bit, I think in the book, I never talk about the plight of the refugee. And my goal is to try to take out that sort of stock phrase and instead recognize that men and women who fled did so often for political reasons, and their political activity continues after they left their home country. And how do we understand that in the camps? So that is larger framing. And what I'm going to do now, and I am going to show you a few images because they were so important to my initial research. I'm going to talk about Guam, and then we're going to move to Malaysia and then to Hong Kong. So hopefully you can bear with me as we move forward in time and space. So I am going to share my screen for a second. Oh, goodness, this is not what I want to show you. Here we go. Here's my book cover. I'm going to, here we go. I should set this up. Slideshow. Current slide. Sure. Okay. This is my book. Also, the artist, Tiffany Chung, is an amazing artist. I'm happy to talk about this image or her work as well. This is just a map to orient you. Guam is where we're going to begin, is here in the Pacific. You should know that it is very far from both Hawaii and California, about 6,000 miles from California, 4,000 miles from Hawaii. Here, of course, is Vietnam, and I'll be talking about Malaysia as well as Hong Kong. This I'll talk about, I already spoke about this. Okay, so this is probably one of the most iconic images at the end of the US war in Vietnam. I could talk about this later. In many ways, my work, I hope, is an argument against this image. Again, I think this image is a bit of an image of passivity, of desired rescue. And in my work, I try to problematize the idea of the United States as being a country that, quote, rescued Vietnamese refugees. But of course, in April of 1975, the North Vietnamese army marched south, and the South Vietnamese government quickly collapsed. And also, of course, although this image is famous, Vietnamese who did manage to get on the helicopter did not go directly to California or to Virginia. Instead, the United States brought over 100,000 Vietnamese to Guam because you cannot go from Saigon to Guam via helicopter, right, or even to the United States. And so the United States brought the Vietnamese who leave in the fall of Saigon, approximately 125,000 people, to Guam for staging. This is a close-up of Guam. For those of you who do not know, and in many ways there's no reason why one might, Guam became a US colony after the Spanish-American War in 1898. The United States has controlled Guam ever since. Guam is very much like Puerto Rico in its political status. People in Guam do not have the right to vote for president, and they do not have voting representation in American Congress. And so when the government chose to use Guam as a staging ground, they did so, and the Guam government had no choice in the matter about whether or not 100,000 Vietnamese were going to arrive that week or not. The Guam government very much has more of a colonial status. It could not overrule the US federal government's desire to bring Vietnamese to Guam. For most of Guam, they were quickly, quote, processed. The US wanted to initially screen people. Who were these individuals? Should the US bring these individuals to the US? But the numbers were quite simply overwhelming. And the United States used provision in US immigration law granting Vietnamese parole status. So they did not enter the US as refugees, even though they'd supported the US, vast majority of these individuals had supported the United States war in Vietnam. Rather, Gerald Ford, who was the president at the time, used his own authority to give them parole status and admit them to the United States. And of the 125,000, 123,000 go on to the United States or Australia or Canada, although the majority do go to the United States. And this is the story which I think most people know about Vietnamese refugees, particularly those who came in 1975. But early in my research, I found this image. And this image to me was absolutely stunning. It was a group of Vietnamese in Guam, and this is about July, August of 1975. And about 1,500 men, and they are mostly men, said they did not want to go on to the United States, that they did not want to resettle in the United States, rather that they wanted to go back to Vietnam. And I was stunned. Who are these individuals? Why did they want to go back? In my common sense understanding, I knew Vietnamese were fleeing the war, wanted to go to America. I also found this image, which I found remarkable. This is on a military base in Guam. These Vietnamese men, again, want to go back to Vietnam, and they are marching with an image of Ho Chi Minh in the background. This is just weeks after the South Vietnamese government collapsed, and all of these men are from Southern Vietnam. What is going on? Very much opposed or in opposition to the far more familiar images that we see of South Vietnamese flags being used by South Vietnamese who then come to the United States. Who were these individuals and why did they want to go back? This was my first real entree into this topic. As you can see, they're young. Most of these men were 18, 19 years old. And what I learned is many of them were in the South Vietnamese Navy and did not choose to, in fact, flee. Rather, they were likely to be on a ship. And in April of 1975, their captain said they could not, that the North Vietnamese had captured Saigon. They weren't bringing the ship back. They don't want the North Vietnamese to have access to the ship. And so with that, the ship went to the Philippines or to Guam, and all of the low-level sailors simply became, quote, refugees. Most of these men wanted to go home to their families, their girlfriends, their parents, had not planned to, in fact, leave. Others were, and some were people whose families were separated. So if I worked very closely with a Vietnamese man who left and went back, Tran Dinh Tru, and his wife was not able to escape. He was desperate to reunite his family, and so he too wanted to return to Vietnam. He saw it as a way of rescuing her and then later coming to the United States. And the US government, at least initially, did not know what to do. The Vietnamese government did not want these individuals back. They feared that they were spies or CIA agents. And the US government didn't really want them staying in Guam, and definitely the Guam government did not want them in Guam. And these men, and again, there are a few women, but it's mostly men, began to protest. And we can see here them marching off the refugee camps in Guam. We can see here them proclaiming that they're on hunger strikes. And these images are from Guam's newspaper. And then they began to burn down buildings on the camp. So these were really fairly drastic acts of protest. Here, and these images are from government photographers. The US military was taking pictures of these men in the camps, documenting these protests. And so eventually the Guam governor came up with a proposal. Give the Vietnamese a ship to return back to Vietnam under their own sail. Could they go US auspices, but under their own power? And so these men said, yes, many of us were in the Navy. We have the skill to return to Vietnam. And the US agrees to give them a ship. And you can see here, this image has always really struck me, the sense of joy and excitement among the young men in the camp when they learn that they will be able to go back to Vietnam. These many, again, who had been in the Navy, then worked to prepare the ship, the Tong Tin 1. There was a captain, Tran Dinh True, who had been in the South Vietnamese Navy for quite some time, and he became the captain of the ship. And about 1,500 people went back to Vietnam in October of 1975. And these individuals, when they returned, this will not be surprising to those of you who study Eastern European history, were very soon put in re-education camps in Vietnam, which were essentially forced labor programs. These were very brutal sets of prison camps that were throughout Vietnam after the war. And although these men had said that they were returning to be with their families, the North Vietnamese government did not trust them, saw them as CIA spies and suspect. And so many were then in these prison camps, some for 2 to 3 months, for Tran Dinh True, the captain, for 12 years. So in many ways, this story ends very tragically or with a very disturbing outcome. But of course, these men did not necessarily know what would happen, and they did want to return. So that is the first story, and it really was those images that brought me to this project. A few things to think about. One, the Vietnamese initially, even though they're referred to as refugees over and over again in the newspapers, legally did not have refugee status. They legally have the status of parolee. And I would suggest to you that every time the government, any government comes up with a new legal status, we need to raise our eyebrows and ask, what is going on? Why is there a new status being developed? Secondly, to recognize Guam's role as a colony. The Guam government had very little control over this, and it may not have authority or sovereignty. Thirdly, to think about the complexities of the Cold War. This story, I think, defies a simple anti-communist, communist binary and provides a much more complicated and unexpected story of Cold War narratives. And finally, seeing the Vietnamese as ongoing political actors who were capable of protest. And yet the individuals I met, many of whom then came to the US in the 80s under other refugee programs, expressed a great deal of regret about their decision to return. So that is story one. Okay, what I want to do next is I'm going to move us to Malaysia. So I will return to the PowerPoint. Oh, and this is a memoir by Tran Dinh True. I found it in the Library of Congress, and I worked with my colleague Bac Bao Tran to translate it. I should add, I do not read or speak Vietnamese, but I did a great deal of work making sure this was accessible in English. So, okay. Technical difficulties, there we go. So now we're going to go to Malaysia. Malaysia is both peninsular Malaysia and Eastern Malaysia. And if you see Vietnam, if you're on a small boat, landing in northeastern Malaysia is one of the more direct routes. So in the 1970s, we have the largest number of Vietnamese who were going by boat were coming to Malaysia. Others were going by land to Thailand, but by boat to peninsular Malaysia. And the 1970s is this era of the quote, boat people. In the late 70s, there are many changes in Vietnam. The Vietnamese government accelerates its programs against private enterprise. There is political or economic discrimination against Chinese Vietnamese. There is a war with China. And there's also the first group of Vietnamese who have been in re-education camps are released 2 or 3 years after the war. And so you have a group of people who have motivations to leave. And this will lead to thousands of individuals leaving by boat in the late 70s. And unlike Guam, the Vietnamese who arrived in Malaysia did not protest for the most part. They did organize politically, but we do not see the same types of protests because for the most part, these individuals wanted to be resettled in the United States, Canada, or Australia. You can see here the Red Crescent Society logos. The Red Crescent Society was very involved in Malaysia. But what I would like to add that while from the United States point of view and rhetoric, the Vietnamese were seen as anti-communist refugees deserving of resettlement, the US still really viewed the Vietnamese leaving as those who supported the South Vietnamese government, those who the US felt an obligation to, a sense of guilt or responsibility. The Malaysian government saw the incoming Vietnamese as illegal immigrants. In addition, we should know that, and that's the status they were given. They were illegal immigrants from the point of view of Malaysia. And I would suggest that Malaysia had a very contradictory policy. On the one hand, Malaysia did in fact allow tens of thousands of Vietnamese to land in Malaysia, to stay in Malaysia for many months, and help them be resettled. And again, the Red Crescent Society was very involved with this. On the other hand, Malaysia created a refugee camp on a small island. This is Pulau Bidong, which is these images are from. It tried to keep them away from Malaysian communities, and it will begin a harsher policy against the Vietnamese arrivals as the numbers continue to increase. And what I would like to emphasize is that Malaysia's politics, I would argue, affect how they see the Vietnamese. And I think this really affects, for example, how Middle Eastern refugees, for example, are seen in Central Europe or the United States today, which is that the Malaysian government saw the Vietnamese potentially subversive themselves. Rather than seeing the Vietnamese leaving a communist country as deserving of resettlement, there's a lot of rhetoric in the newspapers in Malaysia saying that these individuals are coming from a communist country. They may be communists too. And as a result, they might become communist guerrillas in Malaysia, leading to instability in Malaysia. In particular, the Vietnamese who were coming in the late 70s were disproportionately Chinese ethnic minorities within Vietnam. It's a little bit, but it's important because Malaysia has a plurality. They have about, and my numbers are not exact, but about 40% of the population is Malay, about 35 or 40% of the population are ethnic Chinese, and about 15% are South Asian or other identity groups. And so the Malay government, which was largely Malay identified, was worried if incoming Chinese Vietnamese were in large numbers and stayed, that this would disrupt the balance in Malaysia. So I just want to read a few from the Malaysian media. Again, I don't speak Malay or Chinese. This is from English language sources and with the help of translators who worked with me when I was in Malaysia. For example, the Far Eastern Economic Review said that reported that the Malaysian government feared Hanoi was intentionally planting agents among the so-called refugees. The editor, they said, a writer wrote, quote, the in peninsular Malaysia, led by Chin Peng, was and still is dominated by the Chinese. The idea that Chinese are communists is embodied in the minds of the Malays. They form an equation. Chinese equals communists, Chinese equals refugees, therefore refugees equals communists. The government argued for constant vigilance, and it even suggested that many of those who were running away had supported the Viet Cong. In another Malaysian newspaper, it suggested that the Vietnamese could be communist agents. Quote, camps are now scattered on beaches of the whole length of the coast. Any reasonably resourceful communist agent could slip out of such camps. There's no guarantee that they have not already done so. Another reporter who went to Terengganu, which is where the camps were, found that locals were suspicious of the Vietnamese. The boat people are well informed because they are communist agents among them who have come to subvert Malaysian security. One of the people who was interviewed said, I'm 30 years old and I've never handled a weapon, but the Vietnamese, even 5-year-olds, know how to use guns. So we can see here a fear of the Vietnamese. Vietnamese themselves were communists or could bring communism to Malaysia. And this mapped onto specific fears of the history of the Communist Party in Malaysia, which was disproportionately of Chinese identity, although again, not exclusively, but that was how it was seen broadly in the public. And so the incoming Vietnamese as anti-communists, willing to be, needing to be resettled. In Malaysia, we see a very different dynamic. And ultimately, in 1979, the Malaysian prime minister will take a very hard line against the Vietnamese. And he will make a quote. He said, Our patience is fully extended. It's Muhammad Mahathir, who becomes the dominant figure in Malaysian politics for the second half of the 20th century. Our patience is fully extended. If 500,000 immigrants tried to land in Britain, they might probably shoot them. We've already been accused by Newsweek of shooting illegal immigrants, so we might as well do it and justify their accusations. We are being nice and humane, and what do we get? Nothing. So, and essentially, I would argue that he is using extremely violent rhetoric, attempting to move countries like the UK and the United States and Canada to resettle the Vietnamese more quickly. He did not want Vietnamese staying in Malaysia for long periods of time. He was concerned that they were not getting resettled, that they were staying for too long. And so he makes a statement where he's threatening violence against the incoming boats. And this is this idea of push-offs, that the Malaysian government is going to push the boats off at sea. Maybe they'll go to Indonesia, maybe people will drown, but Malaysia's saying, we're not taking everyone. We're going to tell the boats to keep going. And so in 1979, the UNHCR will host a conference. And this will be the first major conference about the status of Indo-Chinese refugees. It brings together resettlement and donor countries, the United States, the UK, France, Australia, Canada. It brings the first asylum countries, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines. It brings Vietnam to the table, as well as many other states. And they come up with an agreement. In 1979, this is the agreement. First asylum. No one should be pushed off. Every boat should be allowed to land. So the push-offs will not be tolerated. Second principle, a guarantee of resettlement outside the first asylum site. So Malaysia and the Philippines and Indonesia all say, we'll take the Vietnamese, but we're not resettling them. That is someone else's responsibility. They must go elsewhere. The money is going to come from the West, the US, Canada, Japan actually gives a lot of money as well. And I don't talk about this as much in my work, but that Vietnam will set up an orderly departure program, allowing for Vietnamese to apply for refugee status from within Vietnam, trying to, again, limit the numbers of people fleeing by boat. So in 1979, this is the conference agreement. And this UNHCR agreement will hold for roughly 10 years, okay, from 1979 until 1988. During that time period, American, British, Australians will go to the camps, they'll interview people, and they will resettle individuals in resettlement sites. Okay, a few main points before we move on to Hong Kong. One, you have Malaysia. I think it's really important to recognize Malaysia's own political history, the dynamics of religious and racial within Malaysia that affects how they view the incoming Vietnamese, and that this is not the same as an American perspective, or is it even the same as the Philippine or the Hong Kong perspective, as I'll mention in a moment. Secondly, to talk, looking at the international level, that the UNHCR is very much involved. This is seen as an international problem, and the goal is a regional solution, which the UNHCR will help broker, okay? So those are the main points coming out of the second case. I want to now talk about the third case, which is Hong Kong. So let me quickly share my screen once again. Here's the images from the Malaysian newspapers, back to sea for all boat people. You can see a very critical language. Here's the segment. So Hong Kong is the last place, and I don't have a map here, but if southern Vietnam pointed towards Malaysia, northern Vietnam pointed towards Hong Kong. So larger numbers of people from northern Vietnam took boats to Hong Kong, which is going to be important in a moment. And this is an image from a Vietnamese artist within the camps, demonstrating sort of life within the camps in Hong Kong. So what is going on in Hong Kong? First of all, 1988, thousands of Vietnamese went to Hong Kong, again, largely in boats, predominantly in boats. But because they were from northern Vietnam, most of these individuals did not meet what the United States believed was a refugee, and this would be true for Australia and Canada as well. Northern Vietnamese, for the most part, had not fought with the South Vietnamese military. They were less likely to be Catholic, and they were less likely to have been in re-education camps. They had not fought with the South Vietnamese or the Army for the Republic of Vietnam, the ARVN. And so Hong Kong, Vietnamese refugees in its camps, and they were not being resettled. And this is because when the US immigration officials went to interview them, they interviewed them and they said, these individuals are not refugees, or they may be refugees, but they're not the refugees that we plan to resettle. We resettle people who had close ties to the United States. Similarly, the UK, Canada, again, was not resettling these Vietnamese in any number. And they would often note that they were from Northern Vietnam, that they didn't have any relationship to Canada or the US or the UK. And so Hong Kong had numbers of people in the camps now, not for 3 to 6 months, but now 2, 3, 4 years. And so Hong Kong can limit the number of Vietnamese coming in, and it also was very concerned about the numbers who were staying. It begins to create a much harsher policy. The goal was, in fact, deterrence. This was the official policy. And they went from camps where Vietnamese could, in fact, live and work. They could work outside the camps and they could go in and out, to closed camps. And the closed camps were often in former prison sites, and they tended to be far more brutal, and they were run by the prisons department. So they became increasingly more like prisons. Then in 1988, when a far larger number of Vietnamese entered Hong Kong, the Hong Kong government decided that it's no longer going to abide by the 1979 agreement. So while in 1979, anyone coming from Vietnam was given refugee status and resettlement, Hong Kong said, we're not needing to accept these people anymore. Instead, we're going to give first asylum, but then we're going to interview people. And we're only going to give refugee status those who can demonstrate that they, in fact, face political persecution. And if they do not succeed in demonstrating that, then we're going to send them back to Vietnam and repatriate them back to Vietnam. At first, this is very controversial. It's controversial in the United States and within the UNHCR. The UNHCR is afraid that this is against its own principle of refoulement, which is sending people back to a place where they may face persecution. And opposed. And Hong Kong says, no, we are not going to accept everyone anymore. We're going ahead with asylum hearings. And then the UNHCR does something which is very notable. The UNHCR under Sergio Vieira, who is an important UNHCR person, and he's killed really tragically during the US war in Iraq. But we are going to, in fact, embrace this. Hong Kong is right. Not every person from Vietnam is, in fact, a refugee. They do not all meet the convention definition of being a refugee. And we will, in fact, embrace this status determination policy. And so there will be another conference in 1989. And in 1989, the same countries that were there in 79 come together, and they come up with a new framework. And the new framework is still first asylum. Boats will not be pushed off. Every boat has the right to land with the goal of not having people die at sea. However, in 1989, every Vietnamese who arrives, the cutoff date is March 15th, 1989. If you come after that date, you will now face an individual status hearing. And if you can prove that you face political persecution, you will get refugee status and resettlement. But if you cannot prove that you have faced political persecution, you will be repatriated back to Vietnam. And so this fundamentally changes the Vietnamese status, and also makes us rethink ideas of the Cold War. The US initially is very opposed to this. The US only supports voluntary repatriations. However, most of these repatriations will not really be voluntary, and many of them will be quite forced. So the Vietnamese who are in the camps in 1989 in Hong Kong, again, will begin to protest. And they do this in multiple ways. First, they bring legal cases. There are multiple legal cases brought in Hong Kong using the Hong Kong legal system. And they win, the Vietnamese win and they lose. The Hong Kong system eventually agrees that the initial hearing processes were unjust, that there were not enough due process. But they also say that the hearing processes can continue, that ultimately that they are legal, and they essentially authorize the hearing processes to proceed. Some Vietnamese, though, do get lawyers. There's a lot of activist lawyers in Hong Kong. Vietnamese Americans also raise money and send lawyers to Hong Kong. And there are white expat lawyers in Hong Kong and Chinese Hong Kong lawyers who take up the case of the Vietnamese in the camps. So we see a lot of legal activism. We also see a lot of direct activism. So here again, you see protest, another hunger strike. Here you can see the South Vietnamese flag. And for my own work, I was always very interested in these images of protest in contrast to the first set of images I showed you from Guam. As you can see, these protests were often very dramatic, often very militant. This is a refugee camp in Hong Kong, and you can see Vietnamese taking to the rooftops as well as marching in the camps. Here, the Hong Kong police force and prisons office are using tear gas to essentially stop the protests in the camps. And these are all protests against repatriation. These are Vietnamese arguing against being repatriated back to Vietnam. And we can see here the use of tear gas and the massive upheavals in the camps. And here are images from the Hong Kong newspapers as Vietnamese are being forcibly repatriated back to Vietnam. And here is an artistic representation of the Vietnamese. And here again, we can see the South Vietnamese flag. And this is again an image of the camps. Ultimately, approximately 66,000 or roughly 60,000 Vietnamese are deported from Hong Kong back to Vietnam, and about 30 to 40,000 other Vietnamese from other camps in Southeast Asia, including Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia, and a very small number from the Philippines, which I can talk about in Q&A. These protests, I think, very few scholars of Vietnamese American history know about them, or at least have written about them. And again, I think they demonstrate political activism within the camps. They demonstrate ongoing political activity. They really, I think, quote, model minorities or sort of grateful refugees that we hear in the US discourse in refugee studies in the United States. And they demonstrate a much more complicated politics of who gets to be a refugee and who does not. So, I didn't mention one other major thing. So then I'm going to wrap up because I know I'm out of time. The context in Hong Kong is really important. The reason why Hong Kong was so this large number of Vietnamese was twofold. One, Chinese coming from China into Hong Kong did not get refugee status. So people in Hong Kong, Vietnamese. Why does a Vietnamese coming from northern Vietnam on a boat get refugee status, while a Chinese individual from Shanghai coming to Hong Kong did not? So many people in Hong Kong said this is unfair. Why do Vietnamese get this special status? My family coming from China are also fleeing a communist country. Why don't they get refugee status? And secondly, time period when Hong Kong is being negotiated from British to Hong Kong status. It's the time period of the joint declaration. And so Hong Kong is both wanting the camps to close before Chinese sovereignty happens in 1997. Also, other Hong Kong people are concerned that they might become refugees after 1997. So they are anxious about these Vietnamese refugees. So those two are the larger pieces about why Hong Kong, we have specific anxiety about the Vietnamese refugees in the 80s and in the 90s. So with that, some final points. First of all, and I don't think I need to really emphasize this with this group who study this point, but being a refugee is not an a priori identity. It is political, It changed over time. It changed depending on when someone left, where someone landed, the politics of the moment, and to recognize the constructed nature of who was a refugee and who was not. I think we see this at the moment with Ukraine, with Eastern Europe, with debates about Afghani refugees and Syrians, both in Europe and in the United States. But very clearly, it is a political identity. Secondly, I would argue that host country and sites need to be seen, that these are not just random or interchangeable places, but rather have their own politics. So Guam, Malaysia, Hong Kong, and the Philippines, the specific domestic politics determined and helped shape the dynamics of refugee politics. In our own moment, I think about Turkey and the politics of the Turkish state vis-a-vis Syrian refugees. I think about the politics of Mexico and its relationship with the United States when thinking about the US border. And today, obviously thinking about places like Poland, Hungary, and Romania as we look at contemporary moments of the immediate moment today. And finally, refugee activism. This is not to say that every individual was involved with the protest. This would also not be accurate, but rather thinking about those who leave as passive and abject, to recognize that many were political in their home countries and they continue to be political in the camps and elsewhere. My work also looks at Vietnamese American activism as it helps people in the camps. And I believe that demonstrating and highlighting this activism hopefully helps reframe how we see refugees, not seeing them as apolitical, but rather seeing them as political actors. So with that, I think I've talked too much. I look forward to your questions, and thank you so much for being here on Zoom.